going to talk about data and logic models and how we look at inputs, outputs, and outcomes when we're doing house liaison work. For this session, I have invited my esteemed colleague, Kristen Ciesmeyer, who is the Director of Institutional Effectiveness at JJC, to help us think through some of these pieces and parts, since this is really how she kind of spends her days in higher ed right now, is thinking about how we measure what we're doing in higher ed. So Kristen is going to be with me for this adventure and with you for this adventure. So here's the agenda for the adventure. We're going to talk about inputs, outputs, and outcomes, and how these items together can create a logic model for you and your house liaison projects. And then we're going to take a little bit of a dive into the various house liaison duties and where we see them fitting into the logic model. That part's going to be very interactive, so we'll ask you all to kind of put your thinking caps on and tell us a little bit about what you've been doing and how you are thinking about, especially outputs and outcomes. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about data sources and especially the kinds of things that you have at your disposal at your community colleges.
And the reason that we are going to talk about some of these things is because ICCB is interested to know about all of these things. And so we're going to try to put some context around it being the logic model. And so what I've done here is basically taken a look at the annual survey that ICCB asked you to complete and did a quick analysis of, well, what do they want to know? And so as I looked through those questions, the majority of them, 11 questions, were about how many. So how many students, how many activities, how many this, how many that. So basically, that data is going to be counting the types of things that you do, the numbers of students that you're working with. So that's the majority of them. And then the other things they're going to be interested in is they want to know how you get this information out to the students. So there are 2 questions about publicity and how that's done. And then they want to know a little bit about the types of services. So there's 1 question about that you offer, and what the outcomes are. We'll talk more about what outcomes are, what your challenges and barriers are to doing this work. And then there's 2 questions about the type of professional development that you've done and what you're interested in for future professional development. So those are the kinds of things that they want answers to. And so as we work through this today, hopefully we'll help you put together what we call this logic model. And as we talk about that, we'll talk about how you come up with the data, the information to answer these questions that they're going to be asking you.
Thanks, Kristen. So when we're building our logic model, we generally think about 3 buckets. So we think about inputs, outputs, and outcomes. And for those of you who are more familiar with logic models, Kristen and I kind of went around about this because you can make this as complex as your heart desires. For us, for today, we're going to stick with this idea of 3 buckets. So inputs, outputs, and outcomes. So inputs are the things that go into making your project happen. So here are some of these kinds of things, right? So it could be the money that you need, the staff and the human power that kind of energizes and provides the services, the spaces that you're using, the supplies or the equipment that you need to provide what you're providing, any technology that you're using in order to help students kind of find their way. All of that is an input, right? And we also include community partners in this because without those additional efforts, some of these projects don't really work, right? Some of these, especially in-house world, some of the things we ask you to do don't really work without community partners. So these are all of the kinds of things that go into a particular project. You may have additional things, that's fine. We're putting these out there to kind of just get your juices flowing about, like, if we wanted you to think about what would be an input, you'd be able to tell us any of these kinds of things that are going on at your institutions. And then the outputs are basically any evidence you have that the program is being implemented. So sometimes that could be counts of activities or services. It could also be any of the materials that you generate. It could be policies and procedures. I know you all were hopefully recently working on your SOPs with Mary. And so thinking about all of those kinds of outputs, when we count them, we generally count them as the number of students served or the number of services provided, right? So when Kristen is talking about here are all the pieces that ICCB wants to know from you, you'll notice like, I think it was like 11 of the counts are the kinds of services that you're providing, right? We're heavy on output counts right now in terms of our program evaluation. What we want to kind of start shifting towards is this idea of outcomes. So moving beyond counting numbers of things and instead thinking about what's the anticipated result, what's that impact that happens as a result of those activities that you're doing. And we can, again, bucket these into three kinds of outcomes. So we can have short-term, midterm, and long-term outcomes. One of the things I think that's difficult in the work that you all do is a lot of times you don't really get to see the long-term outcomes. When we think about even just post-secondary experiences generally, the long-term outcomes are, for the most part, students getting jobs, students getting promoted at jobs, students, buying houses and, kind of moving into that future additional education or wherever they're going next. And we don't often get the data about those long-term outcomes because we're more in the short term and the midterm, right? So short term can be more things like, the student got this grade on a test is very short term, right? Midterm would be more like they completed the semester, they completed the year, they retained to the following year. So thinking about outcomes in terms of these short-term, midterm, and long-term buckets is a way to approach it. If for today you just want to approach it as short-term and midterm, that's fine with us too. I think the challenge also is eventually we're going to ask you to think about what's the data set that you can attach to a short-term or a midterm or a long-term outcome. And I think what you'll find is the college is fully the owner of short-term and midterm data, but not always the owner of the long-term data. So if one of the outcomes we think about for house is that the student gets a house or gets an apartment or becomes more stabilized, the college may not own that information. That may be owned by a community partner, right? So when you're trying to think about measuring your outcomes, try to think about the kinds of information that really you're in charge of and you have access to as an academic institution. So often this is sort of the other place we kind of fall into a little bit of a hole is sort of like, what is this difference really between the outputs and the outcomes? So for this was actually from a project in Michigan where they were kind of talking about what do we see as the difference between outputs and outcomes. So as an example, if the program was a free medical clinic, then the output, what that clinic does is it provides 50 low-income individuals with free doctor's visits. That's the activity that happens. That's the output, right? But then the outcome is that there's a 50% decrease in emergency room visits, right, following that initial contact. So that kind of down the road outcome, what is the ultimate change as a result of folks interacting with that output? Or you can see here like the next one, math tutoring, right? So the output is 70 youth receive math tutoring twice a week during the school year. That's the output, that's the activity, that's what we're doing. But then the outcome, the change as a result is that 100% of the youth served improved their testing scores, right? So that's sort of the difference. Like the output is that countable kind of thing that you're doing, that you're providing, and the output is the change that happens as a result of folks receiving that service.
Another way to think about output and outcome is when you're doing something, that's an output. The activities that you're doing, those are outputs. The outcomes typically relate to the students, for example. It'll be the outcomes for the students. So what will be the changes that the students will experience? So outputs are what you do. Outcomes are typically what happens to the students that you're working with.
So what we want to do is kind of knit these pieces together. And the way that you do that is you create a logic model. So this is a definition from the Kellogg Foundation about logic models as a systematic and visual way to kind of show how these pieces intersect and how the activities as planned result in those kinds of changes that Kristen's talking about. And so again, one of the things that I think is the most helpful about designing a logic model, again, we're connecting inputs, outputs, and outcomes and showing relationships. And all of that to me is important because it does basically the third thing on this list, where you're making explicit the connections between inputs, outputs, and outcomes. So especially if we're trying to argue that we need funding, we can say we need that funding input because it generates this kind of output, which ultimately creates this much outcome. So to be able to connect those buckets, especially for funders or for local stakeholders, I think is one of the most important things about getting into this idea of logic model as a design. And then these last three things on here also, being able to be explicit about your program then helps you to get buy-in from other people. It helps you to kind of set folks' expectations and then kind of manage those expectations. It also helps you to really build a continuous improvement process because you know what you're hoping to see as the outcome of your efforts, right? So you can identify the data that you need to kind of track where are you with those outcomes, how do you need to improve those, what kinds of strategies, and again, thinking about like, what are the questions you really have about how effective the program is for students? So here again, thinking about inputs as what are the resources that are going into the program, our outputs as the activities, and then the outcomes as the changes. And generally speaking, the changes, to Kristen's point, that we're really looking at for the most part are going to be student related. This definition also talks about kind of like larger systemic impacts, and that is also a possibility too. But I think for our exercise today, try to stick with outcomes as it pertains to students and how does your work with them influence this kind of idea of opinions, aspirations, motivations, behaviors, practices, and that kind of thing. So this, if you're actually writing down what a logic model would look like, this is sort of how we imagine it, that it's sort of these three buckets. So we've got our inputs and what we put into the program, the outputs, so what we do and who we serve, and then the outcomes. So Kristen likes to talk about inputs and outputs as the what, and then the outcomes as the so what, right? So we've got inputs and outputs, that's the what of it all, but the outcome is really the what has changed, right? The so what, the why is this important? So as you're kind of thinking through your logic model and thinking about outcomes, the outcomes are the so what, like that's the why we're doing all of this, right? Like what is the impact and how does this change students' lives? Oh, so back to the logic model example. I can remember I put this in here twice. So if we were going to basically take the logic model example of the medical clinic and math tutoring and then kind of build it out as a logic model, it would kind of look more like this, right? Like the inputs that we need for our medical clinic would be things like staffing. So nurses, doctors, right? Medical assistants, front desk staff. You'd also need facilities where you would be doing the exams. You would need equipment, software to do medical charting and all of that kind of stuff, supplies, disposable gloves, stethoscopes, lab coats, et cetera, right? Like those are all the inputs that you would use with your budget to actually create this medical clinic. And then the outputs, so we know that the original chart said 50 low-income individuals receive free doctor's visits. So we could maybe do as outputs the number of patients who got visits, how many visits were provided, how many preventative screenings did we do, how much health education, how many referrals, right? Like all of those kinds of pieces could serve that larger output bucket of 50 folks are getting visits because it would have the data about what happens in those visits. But then the outcome is the change. So while the overall item we would track would be this decrease in emergency room visits, we could also look at things like improvements in chronic condition management, an increased patient understanding of when you use the ER versus when you would use your primary care doctor, improvements in patient trust and engagement in preventative care, and ideally lower overall healthcare costs, right? So all of those pieces could be kind of short, mid, and long-term outcomes that we could look at when we're thinking about this idea of a free medical clinic. So this would be sort of the pieces of the logic model here. And then similarly with math tutoring, same idea. When we're thinking about inputs, it's all the stuff that would go into your tutoring program, right? So tutors, math faculty, books, tutoring appointments, software for booking the appointments, right? Like any of those kinds of pieces. And then the outputs would be, we know 70 youth receiving tutoring twice a week is kind of the overarching output, but kind of thinking about other outputs that are embedded in that larger output would be how many tutoring sessions were delivered per student, how many students regularly attended sessions, right? What was the increased time on task on math practice, the completed skill building exercises, et cetera, et cetera. And then again, the outcome, the ultimate outcome is this improvement in their test scores. But you might also see other kinds of outcomes like increases in student confidence in math, improved completion of homework assignments, right? You might see these other kinds of outcomes that are a product of the outputs. Okay, so now we have a little interactive game for you called Output or Outcome.
And so think of this as your opportunity to practice what Patty has just gone through as far as outputs or outcomes. So our first question here is you as liaisons are going to help students apply for federal and state financial aid. So do you consider that an output or an outcome? And you can come off mute, I believe, or you can put it in chat. So we'll give you a minute to think about it. Output or outcome. So output, again, are the things that you'll be doing, the types of activities, and outcomes are the what you'll see as a result of your activities. So here we are. We're getting a lot of folks putting in the chat. Thank you for that. And so far we're batting a 100% as far as these are outputs. Well done. So we'll move on to the next output or outcome, and that is students receive federal and financial aid. So again, output or outcome. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, 6 in the chat. Again, you guys, and another one. You guys are 100% again. Or what? Maybe we missed it on the last one. These are outcomes, and so why are these outcomes? Again, I may have given you a little hint earlier that if the student is realizing a change as a result of the work that we've done with them, that would be an outcome. So the fact that students are receiving this financial aid is a result of the fact that you as house liaisons help them get that aid. So this would be an outcome. So let's move on to the next one. So U.S. liaisons are intermediaries between students experiencing homelessness and institutional departments. So your role is to get them connected to other resources that they think that might be useful to them. So output or outcome. And again, we see people jumping into the chat here. So this is something you're doing as a liaison to help the students. Anyone else want to jump into the chat? Give you another second to think about this. Output or outcome? Okay. Thank you. And again, this would be an output. All right. So this is work that you're doing, activities that you're doing. Another hint where it says liaison is doing something. These are pretty much outputs, the work that the liaisons are doing, their activities, hoping for an outcome for the students. So next one, Patty, please. The liaisons connect students experiencing homelessness and students in care to their local continuums of care. So output or outcome? Okay, so we've got a couple ideas here. We've got an outcome and we've got an output. So most people are putting in output. This is work that the liaisons are doing. So these are activities as part of your work where you're getting these students connected to a continuum of care. I can see where maybe somebody might say this was an outcome if, from the student perspective, you said the students were connected to the continuum of care, or students relied upon the continuum of care. That could be considered an outcome if the student connected and had a benefit from it. So primarily, though, from this perspective, if we're looking at the liaison is doing the work, we'd probably call this an output. But again, these are why we're doing this with you, just to sort of help you think about output or outcome. So is this work that you're going to be doing, and or is this a result that the student will realize? So I think we have another one, Patty. So, and again, these were taken directly from that survey that ICCB is going to ask you to respond to. So they're looking for specific numbers. How many students did you connect to the continuum of care? So again, that's why we're going through these. So this one, liaison trains the college's employees to identify students experiencing homelessness. Again, an expectation that ICCB has for you to do and to report how many. Okay, and we're getting outputs in the chat, and that's exactly what we're looking for. So those are things that you would be doing. You'd be training the people at your colleges to help identify these students who might be in need of help. So Patty, over to you.
Sorry, I've lost control of the PowerPoint.
You're doing just fine, thank you.
Sorry, everybody. So let's just look at the output answers that Kristen just went over with us. When we think about these four things, right? Because we did have one outcome in there, but I pulled it off this slide for our conversation right now. Thinking about these four items that are outputs, how are you currently tracking data for these four things, and what are you using as that piece of data? And again, you can just like put a letter and then what you're using as your data set, or you can unmute yourself and just talk a little bit about which one you're going to use as your example.
Brittany, are they able to come off mute by themselves?
Yep, as long as they have a working microphone, they are able to unmute themselves.
Thank you. Don't be shy. This is a learning opportunity.
Well, and I keep thinking some of these are maybe easier to capture than other things, right? Like if you're training the college's employees, you probably have some kind of artifact that you used to do the training or like a sign-in sheet, da 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 da. Um, Teresa, thank you. I see you in the chat. So for being an intermediary between other departments, you're using a Microsoft form to collect that data.
Hi, Claire with Lincoln Land. We use Maxient for referral forms, so I can pull data from there. And then we also have a sign-in system where students can make an appointment with me for basic needs. I can pull numbers from there as well. And then for trainings, Microsoft Forms form or sign-in sheet for that.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Claire.
And keep in mind, this can be as simple as you have students come into your office and you keep a tally sheet of how many students you've seen. So again, this doesn't need to be a sophisticated system, although if you have something like Maxient or some other system that tracks the students that come in to see you, the appointments that they have, the forms where you collect who's going to sign up, those are all excellent forms. So, but they can be simple or more complicated, but it doesn't take a lot. Just thoughtfulness.
Yeah. And Crystal, I see you in the chat. I think you're singing my song that you can use Access, but it's not easy to pull the information, and forms would be easier. I think the thing we don't usually spend enough time thinking about is this topic we're talking about right now, right? Like, how are we going to capture this information that we're required to report on? Often that's kind of the last piece of the puzzle that we think about. And it's easier, in my experience, if that's an earlier piece. I would say the first piece, but even if it's a second piece, still don't make it the last piece. But I think that's part of it is a lot of the work that we do, we get very focused on the inputs and the outputs and like creating these programs and services, and then we don't always think about how we're going to need to pull data at the end. So I feel like that's been something where Kristen has been a great help to me in my professional life, thinking about when I'm starting a project, what do I hope the outcome is, and then what kind of data do we have that we can use to demonstrate that? And if we don't have that information, how do we create a system and a structure to hold that? So I appreciate Kristen saying it doesn't have to be fancy, but ideally some form of electronic automation is usually better than me with 1,000 sticky notes trying to kind of organize things. So definitely, I feel you, Crystal, on thinking about like what would be an easier way to do this, and then how do we integrate that, right? And then Teresa, you use titanium software data forms. So same idea, right? That like if we think about electronic ways to kind of capture and trace some of this activity, it gets a little less onerous in some ways, hopefully.
And with Brooke, your pre and post survey is one of those ways that you're going to be able to see that change. So that change that we're hoping for in the outcome, pre and post is perfect for that. So you check where everyone is. And again, this can be as simple as when they come into your pre-session, you have them raise their hand and you count how many hands go up, or it can be written down, be something done online, but you've got where they were at the beginning, and then when they finish, you've got additional information, and that will show you the change. So these are all great ideas. Thank you for putting them out.
And then because the list of what you all report on is extensive, we didn't make slides on every single thing. So these were some of the additional areas where you need to capture outputs, but we didn't do slides for you on these. So again, like take a minute and look these over and just tell us an idea, strategy that you have for capturing data for these outputs.
because I'm sure some of you have great ideas, and we always don't think of everything because we're focused on our own. So this is a great opportunity to share some ideas and get some new ideas that may make your life simpler.
And for those of you who are using different kinds of data forms, do you use them for all of these kinds of things also? Or do you only use them for certain kinds of pieces of the house liaison work?
And if you haven't given this a lot of thought before, now's your opportunity.
Yeah, Claire, I think Maxient is, at least at the colleges where I worked, we did use Maxient as in many ways sort of a catch-all for things. Yeah, and Patricia, I see you, right? So for how many students receive food and basic needs assistance using Teams forms with a QR code that the students can scan and then get live information? That's great. Okay. Okay, so that's all output kind of stuff. Now we're going to talk about outcomes. So we want you to think about one outcome for students that you've had as a result of the house services that or assistance that they've received. Think about like what's your one outcome that you can point to and say, yes, this is a change we've seen with, even if it's just with this one student, right? Like, what is something we can point to and say that's an outcome? And then what piece of data either did you use to document that or could you use to demonstrate that outcome? Yeah, that's great, Teresa, right? So having a student move into transitional housing by connecting them to the continuum of care after living in their car since October. Yes. And Claire connected a student to the continuum of care housing navigator. Yep. And he was able to secure housing. Yeah, that's great with the referral letter. And you used Maxient. Yes. Right. So I think as we start to think about outcomes, we're going to need to get a little deeper into maybe the data that we collect or how we want to, pardon the pun, how we want to house the data. Sorry, there's not a better word. And to these examples that Claire and Teresa are giving us too, talks about this piece where sometimes these outcomes, especially if we're thinking about kind of the mid and longer term outcomes, are going to be pieces that are held more by the community partners data source than by something the college would have. So I appreciate Teresa and Claire, both of you kind of thinking about like, how do you kind of work with your community partner to be able to document that outcome for students so that you're able to hang on to that piece of data? It definitely takes some thinking.
And you may also be able to connect with your career departments or your, within the college, if you have student advising or counselors, anyone else who might be meeting with the students. That's going to take a little bit more effort, though, because you may have to actually contact those people and follow up with them. So a little bit more effort to find out if the students actually went that next step. So, but there are other ways that your institution may be able to help you out. So what we have here is just a screenshot of part of the survey that you fill out for ICCB. And you may have noticed that there are a couple of fields that are auto-populated. So it says here the number of students and students in care reported at your institution. So this data actually comes from what's called an A1 submission. And this is something, it's a data file that your institutional research office submits to ICCB. And basically that file has a lot of information about all the students who are enrolled with a lot of information. And so what ICCB has done for you here is they're saying your institution reported to ICCB X number of students, which is filled into this blank right here, were homeless or students in care. And so this is a number, and I'll give you an example for JJC. The way that we in institutional research get this number is we actually take a look at the financial aid data that we have, and students who are filling out their FAFSA form will indicate if this applies to them, if they are homeless or they are a student in care. And so the number that goes in here is actually obtained from FAFSA data. So I'm not sure how many of your students actually complete those forms, but in most cases, not all students do. So the number that you see in here may actually be smaller than the actual number of students, unless in your institution you've got some way of actually entering that data into your data systems, whatever your student information system is. The other piece of data that ICCB provides for you, go back.
Sorry.
Yeah, is the second part is also populated. So this is 1 year retention rate. And so retention is basically if they were here, if they started in the fall, and then were they here the next fall. So you can go on to the next slide if you would, please, Patty. So those are data that ICCB provides for you, but it's basically from this data that each of your institution provides. So if you weren't aware of it, there's a variety of enrollment information that goes in. It goes in by the term as well as annual enrollment, which is what the A1 report is all about. And you can see that it covers a variety of demographic information, the programs that students are enrolled in, excuse me, as well as what their degrees are. So if a student has earned a certificate or a degree, that will also be noted in this data that the college supplies. So if you go to the next slide, just wanted to give you the definitions that you're using or the other terms that you may see. So if you have a list of the students that you've worked with, it's possible that if you go to your institutional research people, they may be able, for that list of students, to tell you if any of those students actually completed. So that would be a potential outcome. And they can also tell you which of your students that were here last fall are here this fall. So it's a fall to fall, it's called retention. They also may be able to tell you something called persistence, which is how many students who started in the fall are also here in the spring. So if that is useful to you, you might consider contacting your institutional research, but know that they're going to give you that retention rate and the number of students in your program, although your number may vary because you may know that there are more students than they're able to report.
And Claire has something in the chat, but I'm actually going to save her for our next slide.
Okay, yes, I see.
So our next slide, we wanted to just sort of talk about like, what are the outcomes for students, but also what are the challenges that you have as as part of that. And I feel like Claire is kind of hitting on a piece of it, which is when we take snapshots of data and report versus what's happening in kind of the fluid everyday environment where we do work. So I feel like, Claire, what you're pointing to is something that is an ongoing conversation at many institutions. And this idea about snapshot data versus real-time data, and how do you kind of navigate that?
And totally agree, Claire, that what IR captures is literally just a point in time. And so it is not going to ever be as accurate as the kind of data that you'll be able to get live, day-to-day, and capture on all of the students that are there.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Clara. It sounds like maybe you're going to add something.
Well, so I reached out to IRE about getting access to that screen where they capture that. And there is a way, I mean, we're using Illusion. So there is a way to update that. I've just been leery at updating that, like changing anything there for reporting methodology. So I think what I did in the last report is just say, make a statement, this may not accurately reflect, and then use my own data to try a workaround for that.
Exactly. Right. And as I said, there may not be a way for you in a program to actually input the data into the student information system. So that data is usually captured at admissions or again through the FAFSA for most of the information that's in the system. And it's more unusual for people to actually be able to go in and change that data. And the data can also change from term to term. So in the fall, they might be unhoused, but in the spring, they might not be. And so unless your institution has a way of checking that every time students register, or, even in the middle of a term, things could change. And that's what's difficult about the student information systems and trying to keep an accurate, minute by minute count. They're just not set up to do that kind of counting.
But when you think about the kinds of data that Kristen just went over in terms of what the colleges are tracking, some of those I think can be outcomes that you could claim as part of your outcomes for your house liaison activities. So that was something I kind of just wanted to spend a little time thinking through with you all while we have Kristen with us today, is, when you think about, here, I can go back a slide. When you think about especially things like fall to fall retention, or Kristen also mentioned persistence, fall to spring, or completers, could you tag any of these kinds of items as possible outcomes for your house liaison work?
And again, if you have a list of the students can provide it to IR, they can give you a list specific to the students that you're working with.
And then the college would have its overall retention rate.
Right. And you can compare those. So your students may be doing better than the overall rate for the college. And if not, then maybe you don't want to use that. So, but if they are, absolutely use it.
Or I would argue, even if they're not, you could still use that as a baseline where it's like, okay, how large is the gap? And then what your outcome then really becomes is closing that gap. So you would kind of keep looking at that retention, but looking at it annually with the projected outcome of closing that gap. So there's a zero gap between students experiencing homelessness and students in the general college cohort. Does anybody have other ideas about how maybe you could connect these kinds of A1 parts to the work that you're doing? It's okay if not, I just don't want to jump ahead if somebody's got stuff. And I feel like for challenges, I feel like we've covered a few challenges. Are there other things that you think could be obstacles as you go about trying to implement kind of the outcomes piece of the logic model?
And one last question from me, and that is, if in the React area, if you could show a thumbs up for how many people think you could put together at least a very simple logic model for your program with inputs, the resources that you put in, the types of activities that you're doing, and then what your best hope is for the outcomes for your students? Do you think you could at least get something simple put together so you have that as a reference point? Just give us a thumbs up. And if we don't get many, Patty, we might have to do this again. Okay, I'm seeing a few things in the chat next to people's pictures. Thank you. And at any time, if there is any help that I can provide, we're going to have a slide. Please let me know.
Are there any questions you have about the logic model or the data collection that we haven't hit yet? Yeah, and Lauren, you're not alone. I do feel like the House Liaison has kind of a core group that's been with us for the whole 3 years, but there are many new folks to the process. So definitely my contact information is on the next slide. Oh, I lied. The slide after this one, because I wanted to shamelessly plug 2 more professional development items we have going on. So don't forget, we have the House Summit coming up in a few weeks at the Bone Center. And also we have another webinar on the 14th that's going to talk about Perkins funding and how you can connect Perkins funding to what you're doing with House Liaisoning. Yeah, funding, agreed. Claire, come to our session and we'll chat about Perkins. And then here's our contact information. So definitely, Lauren, reach out if there are questions you have or you need some support for sure.
And Beth, thank you for your comment.
Yeah. And I agree. Like, I think funding is definitely a challenge. There's also, I think I sent some of you, or if you came to the roundtables, I had it there too. There is a foundation that has some basic needs funding. So I'll, maybe I'll have Brittany put that on the resource website. Yeah, because I agree. I think funding is definitely would be helpful in the arena for sure. Thanks, Brittany. So in the chat, Brittany's put the House Summit link and also the registration for the Perkins and funding and House webinar. Well, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the fabulous Kristen Ciesmeyer for being our guest star on today's webinar.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You're always a font of information, especially on this kind of idea about outcomes and logic models, and I appreciate your noggin on this topic for sure.
Well, it's always a pleasure to work with Patty, and thank you all for being here today. And thinking about this, and I wish you all the best of luck with the work that you do. It's very important to the students that you reach, so thank you for that.